Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're slipping softly into the quiet world that exists behind every war, every empire, every moment of history you thought you already understood. Not the battles, not the kings, but the shadows, the men and women who shaped the fate of nations without leaving more than a whisper behind. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of spies who changed history forever. The dancer executed at dawn in Paris, the nurse who smuggled soldiers through occupied Belgium, the South African agent who sank a British warship, the double-life diplomat who nearly prevented nuclear war, the forgotten women of the CIA who rewrote the rules of espionage with nothing but courage and quiet brilliance, and the digital ghosts of our own age, the hackers, the whistleblowers, the deepfake architects, the invisible hands that reshape reality from behind glowing screens. These are not the spies of action movies. These are the ones who moved gently, silently, in the spaces between truth and illusion. The ones who changed the world while the world was asleep. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, settle into the calm of the night, and let me take you into the shadows, where history was rewritten by people the world was never meant to see. Paris, October 15th, 1917. Before sunrise, the city was still wrapped in a cold, gray silence, the kind of silence that lives between footsteps in an empty street. And in the courtyard of the Vincennes military barracks, a woman stepped out of a prison car, her black fur coat brushing softly against the gravel. She was 41. Elegant even in the dim light, and she refused the blindfold offered to her. Instead, Mata Hari lifted her chin, kissed the hand of the priest beside her, and turned calmly toward the 12 rifles waiting to erase her from history. To some, she was a temptress, to others, a traitor. But the truth, like all truths in wartime, was softer, darker, and far more complicated. Her story did not begin with danger or seduction. It began in a windy Dutch town where a little girl named Margaretha Zell grew up listening to the creaking of ships in the harbor. Her childhood was not the glamorous legend she later created. Her father's charm dissolved into bankruptcy. Her mother's warm presence vanished in illness, and by the time she reached her teenage years, life had already taught her that promises break more easily than glass. When she fled to the Dutch East Indies after marrying a stern military officer, she carried with her only two things: a wounded heart and a deep desire to reinvent herself. That desire became her compass. Years later, in Paris, a city humming with velvet lights and cigarette smoke, she stepped onto a stage under a new name, Mata Hari, the Eye of the Day. She danced like no one else, not with speed or precision, but with a quiet, hypnotic grace. When she moved, The room breathed with her. Politicians, generals, princes, wealthy travelers, they all watched her with the same mixture of fascination and hunger. And soon the woman who once felt invisible became one of the most sought-after performers in Europe. But fame is its own kind of trap, and when war erupted in 1914, every whisper around Mata Hari suddenly mattered. She crossed borders, charmed officers, dined with ambassadors, and accepted gifts from men in uniforms, French blue, German gray. To her, these men were companions, admirers, lonely souls in a world collapsing into fear. To the governments watching her, she was something far more dangerous, a double agent, or perhaps a triple agent, or perhaps just a convenient scapegoat. The truth is that the evidence against her was thin, almost transparent, like smoke that dissolves the moment you grasp it. But France was bleeding, millions dead, morale collapsing, betrayal hiding in the shadows. Someone needed to pay. And Mata Hari, the foreign dancer with the mysterious smile, became the perfect symbol of treason. On her final night, she did not cry. She asked only for a glass of brandy and wrote a few letters that never reached the people they were meant for. Soldiers said she slept peacefully, as if the world had finally stopped asking her to perform. Hours later, she walked into the courtyard with a stillness that made even the guards hesitate. She faced the rifles the way she once faced the audience, calm, composed, and strangely luminous. Some said she even blew a kiss. Whether that is truth or legend no longer matters. What matters is the echo she left behind. Because Mata Hari was not the first woman to be destroyed by wartime paranoia, and she would not be the last. And tonight, as we slip deeper into this story, we follow that echo, not loudly, but gently, into the hidden world of espionage, where shadows speak louder than words, and where a single whispered secret could change the course of an entire century. And Mata Hari, she is only the beginning. Tonight, as we drift farther from the bright stage lights that once followed Mata Hari, we enter a dimmer world, one without dancers, without applause, without names printed in newspapers. A world held together by shadows, paper, ink, whispers, and choices made in the quietest corners of a war that swallowed continents. During the First World War, the deadliest networks were not the trenches you've seen in old photographs. They were the invisible corridors carved by spies, nurses, code breakers, and messengers who carried secrets instead of weapons. And among these ghosts, one figure walked with a lantern of compassion rather than cunning. Her name was Edith Cavell. She was not trained to deceive or to kill or to manipulate. She was a British nurse stationed in German-occupied Belgium, a place where every street was watched and every stranger could be an informant. Yet night after night, she guided wounded soldiers, British, French, Belgian, through back alleys, farmhouses, and safe houses, helping more than 200 men slip quietly across the border to freedom. She never carried a gun. She carried stitches, bandages, and a belief that every person, friend or enemy, deserved a chance to go home. When she was captured, she confessed everything, not out of fear, but out of a calm conviction. I must have no hatred or bitterness toward anyone. At dawn, when the rifles were raised, she stood the way a healer stands, upright, steady, almost weightless. And in that moment, the world learned that even a nurse can shake an empire. But the war was vast, and the shadows were full of other figures, some noble, some ruthless, all unforgettable. Far from Belgium, under the African sun, a man named Fritz Joubert Duquesne used charm like a blade. He was a hunter, a soldier, a con artist, and to many, the most dangerous spy the war ever produced. He blended into every room he entered, changing accents the way others changed coats. And he carried a personal hatred for the British so deep it burned like a second heartbeat. That hatred led him to a single mission, to strike at the heart of the empire he despised. When HMS Hampshire, one of Britain's proudest warships, set sail carrying the famous Lord Kitchener, Duquesne slipped a whisper into the right ear, a false report into the right hands, and a plan into the right shadows. Hours later, the ship exploded off the coast of Scotland, swallowed by a storm of metal and icy waves. To this day, historians debate how much of the attack was Duquesne's doing, but in the world of spies, truth is often a shape made of fog. And in that same fog, another kind of weapon was being forged, not by soldiers, but by mathematicians and linguists studying patterns like constellations. It was called the Zimmermann telegram. A message sent in secret codes, numbers, symbols, hidden keys, offering Mexico German support if it attacked the United States. It should have been unreadable. Instead, it became the spark that pulled America into the war. One telegram, one mistake, one whisper decoded, and the world changed course. But stories of espionage in WW1 were not only about great names or famous operations. Much of the war's invisible machinery was powered by quiet hands inventing quiet miracles. Spies carried letters written in invisible ink made from crushed aspirin, onion juice, even dissolved milk. Some hid messages under postage stamps. Others used silk maps that could survive water, fire, and capture. And above the trenches, hundreds of messenger pigeons, small, trembling, determined, carried rolled-up secrets tied to their legs, flying through bullets and smoke to deliver hope on fragile wings. Many never returned, yet they saved thousands of lives. Tonight, as we breathe slower and sink deeper into this soft darkness, we remember the ones whose names were never recorded, the men and women who vanished between borders, the code breakers who slept beside their desks, the couriers who walked into the night and did not walk back. Their stories will never fill textbooks, but they shaped the silence we inherit. And before this chapter closes, here are 3 of the strangest spy technologies whispered through the war's hidden corridors. A box of hollow buttons that hid micronotes the size of grains of rice. A revolver that fired cyanide capsules instead of bullets. And tiny listening beetles, primitive microphones disguised as insects, placed in walls to catch the softest conversations. Each invention was small, almost invisible, yet in a world on fire, it was often the smallest secret that decided which way history would turn. And now, as this night grows calmer, we move deeper into the labyrinth of espionage, following the faint trail left by those who risked everything not for glory, but for a single message carried through the dark. Tonight, we drift into a quieter, colder chapter of the spy world, far from the chaos of war and the smoky dance halls of earlier stories. This chapter begins not with a whisper in Paris or a coded message from Berlin, but with the slow, deliberate breath of a young man in Moscow. His name was Oleg Gordievsky, and long before he fooled the KGB for 30 years, he was simply a son of the Soviet Union, shaped by a system that expected loyalty, obedience, and silence. In 1963, the world was trembling beneath the weight of the Cold War. Missiles, secrets, suspicion, they hung in the air like winter fog. And somewhere in that fog, the KGB was looking for new blood, sharp minds, clean faces, sons of patriots. Oleg fit the mold perfectly. His father had served the state. His brother was already part of the intelligence world. To the KGB, the Gordievsky family seemed carved from the same stone as the Soviet Union itself. When Oleg stood in the recruitment office, a narrow room smelling faintly of paper and authority, he felt something close to pride. This was what young men were supposed to become, guardians of the motherland, protectors of the revolution, eyes in the dark. And yet, even in those early days, something in him felt misaligned, like a piano key pressed gently out of tune. He admired the discipline, but not the ideology. He followed orders, but he questioned the cost. He wanted to serve his country, yet sensed his country was drifting far from the ideals it claimed to defend. Still, the KGB trained him. They molded him. They sent him abroad as a diplomat, though everyone understood that diplomat was just a softer word for spy. He traveled, he observed, he reported, and each step took him farther from home and closer to a quiet truth. The world outside the Soviet Union was not the monster he had been taught to fear. It had color, it had music, it had conversations that were not wrapped in fear. And in that contrast, a seed began to grow, something dangerous, something forbidden, doubt. Not loud doubt, soft doubt, the kind that wakes you at 3 a.m. with a whisper. What if everything you were taught is wrong? In 1968, Oleg was stationed in Denmark, and Denmark, with its bookstores, its open debates, its calm honesty, changed him. He saw a society that was not collapsing. People were not starving. The streets were not filled with capitalist misery, as Soviet newspapers claimed. And when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, something inside Oleg finally cracked. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, lights dim, feeling a quiet grief, as if a curtain had fallen inside his chest. He realized he could no longer serve a system that feared freedom more than enemies. It took 6 more years for the quiet grief to turn into action. In 1974, the world shifted again, and so did Oleg. He was approached by MI6, the British intelligence service. They had been watching him, sensing the tremble beneath his Soviet loyalty, seeing the way he observed the world with eyes that still searched for truth. When he said yes, it was not with excitement or rebellion. It was with relief, like a man finally stepping on steady ground after years of standing on ice. And that yes marked the beginning of a double life. One man, two faces, a heartbeat divided between two worlds. He was now a KGB officer and a secret asset of MI6. Only a few knew. None could imagine the extent to which he would change history. For the greatest secrets of the Cold War were not hidden in nuclear silos or missile bases. They were hidden inside people. Perhaps none more quietly powerful than the man who would soon risk everything to keep the world from sliding into nuclear fire. This was the birth of Oleg's second life, a life that would test his courage, his sanity, and ultimately, his heart.
By the early 1980s, Oleg Gordievsky's life had become a quiet balancing act, one that only a few human beings in history have ever attempted without breaking. On the surface, he was everything the KGB admired: disciplined, sharp, loyal, a man molded by decades of Soviet service. But beneath that surface lay another pulse, another loyalty, another truth, one that beat silently for MI6. And London, with its gray skies and calm streets, became the stage on which he performed the most delicate double life of the Cold War. When Oleg arrived in Britain in 1982 under diplomatic cover, he stepped into a world that felt both liberating and suffocating. Liberating because it was the Western freedom he had long believed in. Suffocating because every freedom was shadowed by the fear that the KGB might be watching from behind any door, inside any room, beneath any conversation. In the mornings, he attended embassy meetings, drafting reports that traveled straight back to Moscow. In the afternoons, he collected small pieces of political gossip, strategic whispers, and fragments of intelligence. And at night, he gave those fragments to MI6, sometimes through a coded conversation during a casual walk, sometimes through a dead drop hidden behind a loose brick, sometimes through a single, silent signal. He became both observer and participant, both messenger and saboteur. The KGB entrusted him with analysis on NATO, on British politics, on nuclear negotiations. They believed him. They needed him. They never imagined he was slipping the same information, filtered, sharpened, clarified, into the hands of Britain. And that unique position, floating between two worlds, allowed him to see something few people ever saw clearly: how close humanity came to the edge of nuclear war. It happened under the code name Ryan. To the Soviets, Operation Ryan was not just a project, it was a fear turned into a mission. They believed the West was preparing a secret nuclear first strike. Not tomorrow, not someday, soon, very soon. And because they believed it, they searched obsessively for signs. Lights left on in government buildings, unusual military exercises, even the tone of speeches by Western leaders. To the KGB, everything looked like a clue. Every coincidence looked like a threat. Every gesture looked like a countdown. But Oleg, reading the same signs, knew the West was not preparing for war. He knew the paranoia running through Moscow was spiraling, tightening, pulling the world toward a misunderstanding that could end millions of lives. So he became, in secret, a bridge, a translator of fear. He carried Moscow's anxieties to MI6, helping them understand the depth of Soviet terror. And in return, MI6 used him as a steadying voice, sharing signals that reassured Moscow without revealing their source. Those quiet exchanges, buried in diplomatic memos and political gestures, softened tensions at the very moment the Cold War was ready to ignite. Some historians say Oleg helped prevent nuclear war. Others say he altered the temperature of the world just enough to keep the worst from happening. But in the quiet hours of the night, when he lay awake staring at the ceiling, Oleg wasn't thinking about geopolitics. He was thinking about his daughters in Moscow, his wife, his family living under a system that believed he was loyal. The weight of that lie pressed into his chest like a stone. A double life is not glamorous. It is not like the movies. It is sleepless nights, hidden guilt, the fear of a knock on the door, the fear that one misplaced glance, one wrong word, one unlucky shadow could end everything. During these years, Oleg used simple objects to communicate with MI6. Objects so ordinary they became invisible. A green matchbox in a window, a folded Safeway shopping bag, a signal triggered by nothing more than a walk down a particular street. Each item was a heartbeat in a silent conversation between two intelligence worlds. Each sign carried the same meaning. It's safe. It's time. Help me. And yet, for all his precision, for all his discipline, Oleg sensed something shifting in 1985. Whispers in the embassy grew sharper. Questions grew heavier. Eyes lingered a little too long. Moscow wanted answers. The double life was beginning to fray. And deep down, Oleg knew the curtain was about to fall. He would have to run soon, or never again see the sky as a free man.
By May of 1985, the double life Oleg Gordievsky had carried so carefully began to tremble like a glass touched by an unexpected wind. He felt it in the embassy hallways, the sudden silences, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the measured looks that lingered 1 second too long. Moscow had questions, and questions in the world of the KGB were rarely just questions. They were warnings. They were shadows of something approaching. What Oleg didn't know yet was that a traitor inside the CIA had given his name to the KGB. The noose had quietly begun to tighten. One morning, he was summoned back to Moscow. The letter looked like an ordinary recall, routine even. But to a man who understood the KGB's patterns, it felt like the soft rustle of a curtain before the lights go out. Still, he went home, because refusing to go would be even more suspicious. Moscow was heavy that summer. Gray skies, long hallways, and interrogations disguised as conversations. They asked about his trips, his acquaintances, his habits, his loyalties. They asked the same questions again days later, looking for the slightest inconsistency. Oleg answered calmly, softly, but he could sense the ground crumbling under his feet. Then came the order: psychological tests, isolation, daily questioning. The KGB was circling him, and he knew they would not circle forever. Soon, the trap would close. And so, One quiet evening, after a day of interrogation, he walked through a Moscow street with the slow, deliberate steps of a man preparing to disappear. When he reached a certain bench in a certain park, he placed a small green matchbox at the exact right corner. It looked meaningless, but to MI6, it was a flare in the dark. Activate the escape plan. From London, the response came quickly. The plan had existed for years. An improbable, cinematic, almost impossible rescue called Operation Pimlico. It required timing, courage, and a miracle. MI6 agents drove into the Soviet Union under diplomatic protection. Their BMW waited near the border with Finland, hidden behind trees and dusk. And between Moscow and that border lay hundreds of miles of danger. On the appointed day, Oleg left his apartment carrying nothing but a small bag, a sliver of hope, and the knowledge that if even one stranger recognized him, everything would end. He boarded a train heading northwest. The carriage shook softly, the landscape passing like a muted painting. Towns, forests, abandoned fields. Each mile was a heartbeat. Each stop was a risk. When he stepped off near the rendezvous point, MI6 officers were already watching from a distance, pretending to be tourists. They walked calmly, never looking directly at him, never acknowledging him. The choreography of survival is often made of silence. At a quiet roadside, the BMW pulled close. Oleg slipped into the back seat, sinking into the leather like a man exhaling for the first time in years. They drove through the Soviet countryside in tense stillness, windows down just enough to hear the insects, the wind, the low hum of danger waiting in the shadows. When they approached the Finnish border, the final obstacle appeared. Soviet guards inspecting every car, every trunk, every passenger. If they opened the BMW's back door, if they searched the trunk where Oleg was hiding under blankets, everything, MI6, his career, his future, would collapse in seconds. The guards circled. They flashed their lights. One leaned closer, squinting. Then, with a gesture almost too small to notice, they waved the car forward. And just like that, the BMW rolled into Finland. For the first time in months, Oleg breathed freely. But the escape had a cost, one deeper than the fear he left behind. His wife and daughters remained in Russia. He had no way to warn them, no way to bring them, no way to say goodbye. For 6 years, he would not see them. For 6 years, he would live with the weight of freedom purchased at the price of separation. And yet, as he crossed into the soft Finnish night, he understood something quietly profound. Some escapes are not victories, they are sacrifices. The Cold War would continue for a few more years. Nations would rise and fall, but somewhere behind the pages of history, the quiet story of a man who lied to the KGB for 30 years would settle like dust, gentle, nearly invisible, but powerful enough to shape the world.
Tonight, we drift into a chapter lit not by gunfire or coded telegrams, but by the soft, persistent glow of people history almost forgot. Spies whose names did not echo through war rooms or newspapers, not because they lacked courage, but because society never expected them to be dangerous. And that unexpected invisibility, quiet, ordinary, almost gentle, became their greatest weapon. During the Second World War, military leaders looked for men, tall, trained, hardened. They imagined spies as shadows with sharp jaws and colder hearts. They never imagined danger wrapped in silk gloves, or power standing on one leg, or a revolutionary spirit hiding behind a warm smile. And that blind spot changed history. Women slipped through borders, through checkpoints, through conversations, not because they were underestimated, but because they were unseen. And among all those unseen figures, one woman walked most defiantly through the dark: Virginia Hall. Her story does not begin with triumph, but with loss. She had dreamed of becoming a diplomat, a voice for peace. But after a hunting accident shattered her leg, she was left with a wooden prosthetic she named Cuthbert. Because of it, her dream job refused her. The world told her she couldn't. She decided that meant she must. In 1940, as Europe fell into the jaws of war, Virginia joined the British SOE, the organization that trained ordinary people to fight tyranny in extraordinary ways. She was sent into France, moving from village to village with forged documents and a quiet confidence that made even Gestapo officers overlook her. Her limp should have made her stand out. Instead, it made her seem harmless. And so she became the most effective Allied agent France had, organizing resistance networks, rescuing downed pilots, slipping information through German checkpoints with nothing but charm and determination. But her rising influence did not go unnoticed forever. The Gestapo gave her a code name, the Limping Lady. They put her on a most wanted list, describing her as the most dangerous British agent in France. When the net tightened around her, she disappeared into the mountains. Imagine her now, a woman with a wooden leg climbing the Pyrenees in winter, snow up to her knees, wind cutting her breath into pieces. Every step was pain. Every hour was a decision to keep going. A wooden leg does not forgive the cold, but she kept going anyway. She crossed into Spain after days of climbing, frostbitten, exhausted, but alive. And when the British government suggested she retreat home, rest, recover, she simply shook her head. "I can do more." That was her only answer. And she did. She returned to France under a new identity, building networks so effective that her work would shorten the war for thousands. But Virginia Hall was not alone. She was part of a silent revolution. Women who succeeded precisely because no one believed they could. Women who blended into markets, cafes, train stations. Women who carried explosives in handbags, maps sewn into hems, radio codes hidden in recipes. Women who told jokes to German soldiers while memorizing the layout of their checkpoints. Historians estimate that nearly 60% of the most successful field operatives of World War II were women. Not because they were stronger, not because they were trained better, but because society, blinded by its own assumptions, looked straight at them and never saw a threat. And there, in that blind spot, they rewrote history in the quietest, bravest ways imaginable. Tonight, as we rest deeper into this story, we follow their footsteps, Not the loud ones that armies leave behind, but the soft ones that slip through locked doors, through guarded borders, through the silent corners where courage rarely receives applause. This is the world Virginia Hall opened for us, a world where the invisible became unstoppable, and where the quietest people carried the loudest truth, that heroism often whispers long before it ever speaks.
Tonight, as we drift further into the hidden world of women who shaped history from the shadows, the story grows softer, more fragile, like a candle protected by cupped hands in the wind. And at the center of that fragile light stands a woman whose courage did not roar, but glowed quietly, steady, unwavering, impossible to extinguish. Her name was Noor Inayat Khan. To the world she came from, she was a princess, daughter of an Indian Sufi musician and an American mother, raised in a home filled with poetry, music, mysticism, and kindness. She grew up believing in nonviolence, in compassion, in the sacredness of every soul. Nothing about her hinted at espionage. Nothing suggested danger. And maybe that's why she became one of the most extraordinary agents the world would ever know. When the Second World War erupted across Europe, Noor found herself standing at a crossroads between the gentle philosophy she had been taught and the brutal reality swallowing the world. She joined the WAAF, then SOE, the same covert organization that sent Virginia Hall into France. But Noor was given a mission even more dangerous. She would be a wireless operator. The lifespan of wireless agents in occupied France was measured not in years or months, but in weeks. They were hunted relentlessly. Their signals were traced. Their slightest mistake could lead to torture or death. And yet, Noor went. Not with the cold determination of a soldier, but with the quiet bravery of someone who believed that protecting others mattered more than protecting herself. Paris greeted her with a strange, aching beauty. Cobblestone streets, shuttered apartments, cafes holding their breath under German patrol. She blended into it like a soft note in a dark symphony. For weeks, she sent messages back to London, her fingertips dancing over the radio keys while danger lurked outside every window. Operators were supposed to move constantly, but Noor stayed. The network she worked with collapsed around her. Arrests, betrayals, disappearances, but she refused to leave her post. Alone, marked, hunted, she continued her transmissions. London expected her signal to go silent at any moment. Instead, it grew steadier, clearer, almost defiant. She became the last functioning link between London and the entire Paris resistance. But the walls eventually closed in. One night in October 1943, through betrayal that would never be fully understood, Noor was captured. When the Gestapo searched her belongings, they found no weapon, no coded notes, only her notebooks filled with stories she wrote for children. Even then, she tried to escape. Once, twice, 3 times,
running with the sudden desperation of a bird who refuses to accept a cage. After her final attempt, they labeled her highly dangerous, chained her hand and foot, and sent her to Dachau. She spent 10 months in solitary confinement. No sunlight, no names, no softness. Yet the guards noticed something bewildering. She never broke. She never revealed a single secret. And she never let hatred enter her voice. In September 1944, she was taken to Dachau. The night was cold. The walk was short. When the end came, she did not beg. She did not tremble. Her final word, spoken softly but clearly, was liberté, freedom. A whisper that outlived the bullets. Tonight, as we drift deeper into this story, we hold that whisper gently in our hands. Because Noor Inayat Khan, the princess who believed in peace, taught the world something quietly profound. Courage does not always shout. Sometimes it is simply choosing not to break, no matter how dark the night becomes.
Tonight, our story moves into a softer rhythm, like a hushed melody, floating through an empty theater long after the audience has gone home. Because some spies did not hide behind false passports or shadowed alleys. Some hid in songs, in stage lights, in silk gowns that shimmered under applause. And among them, the most dazzling figure of all was Josephine Baker, an entertainer who made the world laugh, then used that laughter to slip secrets past the eyes of an empire. Before she was a spy, Josephine was a storm of glamour and mischief, born into poverty in St. Louis, but rising to become the brightest star of jazz-age Paris. Crowds adored her, photographers chased her, soldiers, ambassadors, aristocrats, they all watched her with the same careless assumption. A beautiful woman could not be dangerous. And Josephine understood something powerful hidden inside that underestimation. She knew invisibility was not just about being unseen. Sometimes it was about being seen in exactly the way the enemy wanted, and nothing more. When the Nazis marched into France, Josephine refused to flee. Instead, she joined the French resistance. Her concerts continued, her laughter continued, her dazzling gowns continued, but beneath the glamour, she became a courier of secrets. Messages were written in invisible ink on her sheet music. Notes were tucked between the bars of melodies, hidden so cleverly that even a trained officer would see nothing but song. And as she traveled across borders to perform, she carried those secrets with the boldness of someone no one would ever dare to search. After all, who would suspect Josephine Baker, the woman who danced with feathers and made crowds roar, to be smuggling military intelligence in her luggage? But Josephine was only one note in a larger symphony of women who shaped espionage from behind the curtain. Another woman stepped into this secret world not through the stage, but through the quiet corridors of bureaucracy. Her name was Eloise Page. To the untrained eye, Eloise seemed ordinary, almost intentionally so. Soft-spoken, neatly dressed, more like a librarian than a spy. But that quiet exterior concealed one of the sharpest intelligence minds of the 20th century. In the 1950s, long before the CIA allowed women to serve openly as officers, Eloise became one of the agency's first female operatives. Her postings took her around the world, but it was her assignment in China that history would whisper about most. China was a puzzle of shifting alliances, coded gestures, and constant surveillance. To survive there required not only skill, but the ability to vanish inside a room without ever leaving it. Eloise mastered that art. She listened more than she spoke. She observed more than she demanded. She pieced together information the way a seamstress pieces silk, quietly, precisely, patiently. Her reports shaped American strategy during some of the Cold War's most volatile years. Yet, outside a small circle of colleagues, almost no one knew her name. And that was the true magic of her work. She did not need applause. She needed silence. She understood that the most powerful spies were not the ones who kicked down doors, but the ones who walked through them without anyone remembering they passed. Tonight, as these stories settle like dust across the room, we begin to understand something history rarely admits: that invisibility was not a weakness. It was a weapon. And women, dismissed, doubted, underestimated, wielded it with a mastery men rarely achieved. Historians now estimate that nearly 60% of the most successful operatives of the 20th century were women, not because they were stronger or more ruthless, but because society had handed them the perfect disguise: insignificance. But they were never insignificant. They shaped wars. They saved nations. They slipped through checkpoints, through parlors, through the blind spots of men who assumed danger only came in familiar forms. And as this chapter comes to a close, we feel their footsteps like soft echoes. Josephine's laughter drifting through a Parisian night, Eloise's quiet pen scratching secrets into a report meant for only a few eyes. A quiet revolution, carried out not with violence, but with patience, precision, and an understanding of the shadows that changed the world forever.
We drift into one of the quietest, strangest, and most unsettling chapters in the entire history of espionage. A chapter that did not begin on the battlefield, nor in the cold rooms of MI6 or KGB headquarters, but in the polished hallways of a university, where young men debated philosophy, sipped tea under old portraits, and believed ideas were more powerful than guns. It was Cambridge in the mid-1930s, when the world trembled between wars. Fascism was rising in Germany. Authoritarianism was tightening its grip across Europe. And to a generation of students who felt that the old world had failed them, Communism did not look like a threat yet. It looked like hope. It looked like fairness. It looked like the opposite of everything they blamed for the Great War. Into this environment walked 5 young men who would one day become the most damaging spy ring the United Kingdom had ever known. But back then, they were simply students, restless, idealistic, brilliant, and dangerously certain they were on the right side of history. Their names would later echo like a slow, unfolding tragedy. Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, and John Caircross. But in 1934, they were not the Cambridge Five, not yet. They were just a group of friends walking across green courtyards after lectures, listening to debates in smoky rooms, questioning the establishment they had been born into. They believed the British elite had failed their country, failed the world, and would fail again. And somewhere in that mix of arrogance, idealism, and youthful fire, the seeds of betrayal were planted. Soviet recruiters understood something chillingly simple. The most effective spies were not the desperate, but the idealistic. Men who thought they were saving the world were far easier to guide than men who served only for money. And so Cambridge became a hunting ground, not for soldiers, but for thinkers. Soviet agents watched the brightest minds, looking for students whose hearts burned with anger at injustice, whose minds rejected tradition, whose loyalty to Britain had never fully formed. Philby was the first to be drawn in. Charming, confident, sharp as a blade. He believed the world needed revolution, and he believed he was destined to play a role in that revolution. Burgess followed, unpredictable, charismatic, and reckless, drifting through Cambridge like a man who loved chaos just a little too much. Maclean was more serious, more thoughtful, but deeply troubled by Britain's diplomatic hypocrisy. Blunt was elegant, quiet, intensely private, someone who wore his intelligence like a mask. Caircross, the last of them, was the outsider. Brilliant, solitary, unnoticed, and therefore perfect. Between 1934 and 1937, each man crossed an invisible line, so slowly and quietly that even they did not realize the magnitude of what they had chosen. They handed over essays at first, then opinions, then assessments of their professors. The Soviet handlers appeared as mentors, not criminals. Encouragement felt like purpose. Flattery felt like destiny. By the time the 5 men graduated, the Soviets no longer saw them as students, they saw them as investments. Investments that would one day infiltrate the highest levels of British diplomacy, MI5, MI6, the Foreign Office, and military intelligence. And the most haunting part of this chapter is not the betrayal itself, but the psychology beneath it. These were privileged men, educated, protected, loved. So why did they turn against their own country? Why communism? Why espionage? The answer drifts through the decade like fog. It was not loyalty to the Soviet Union, but disillusionment with Britain. They believed their own government was morally bankrupt. They believed capitalism had led to war,
They believed communism, before its horrors were exposed, was the only path that promised equality. And so, in rooms filled with books and soft lamplight, these young men convinced themselves that betraying Britain was not treason, it was justice. It was righteousness. It was history calling them. As we end this part of the journey, we leave them standing in the twilight of their youth. Idealists who still believed they could reshape the world. They had no idea how many lives their choices would unravel. They had no idea that decades later, their names would become synonymous with betrayal. For now, they remained shadows in the making. History had not revealed their true faces yet.
Tonight, as we move deeper into the quiet corridors of betrayal, the shadows begin to take shape. Ideology, once abstract and idealistic, now becomes a weight, heavy, irreversible, impossible to put down. And at the center of those deepening shadows stands the most enigmatic figure of them all, Harold Kim Philby. To the world, Philby was everything a British intelligence officer should be: polished, articulate, impeccably charming. He carried an easy smile, the kind that reassured people without ever revealing a single truth. But behind that smile, behind the soft voice and tailored suits, was a man who had already crossed a line he could never uncross. By the 1940s, Philby was no longer just an idealist. He had become one of the Soviets' most prized assets, moving upward through British intelligence with a grace so natural it seemed effortless. And yet, nothing he did was effortless. Every conversation, every gesture, every friendship was a calculation, an elegant performance designed to keep two worlds from colliding. But the center of his life was a secret he protected with more devotion than any national oath. He believed he was on the right side of history. Tonight, as we watch him walk through the fog of London streets in his overcoat, cigarette glowing in the dark, we watch a man who had convinced himself that deception was a form of duty. But Philby was not alone. His closest friends from Cambridge, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, were slowly drifting toward disaster. Burgess was the storm, brilliant, chaotic, self-destructive. A man who could charm a room in a single breath and ruin his career in the next. He drank too much, spoke too loudly, burned through every boundary as if they were made of paper. And yet, for reasons history still debates, the Soviets trusted him. Maclean was different, intelligent, serious, increasingly frayed by the strain of living a double life. His drinking worsened, his temper shortened. The pressure of carrying diplomatic secrets for two nations pulled him apart thread by thread. MI5 began to notice patterns, messages, leaks, whispers that painted toward a mole, a code-named American diplomat working for the Soviets. They did not yet know the name, but the circle was closing. Philby saw it first. He recognized the signs not as an investigator, but as someone protecting a friend. As Maclean's behavior spiraled, the Soviets grew anxious. Exposure was coming. Arrest was coming. And in the spring of 1951,
Philby made a decision that would alter the course of British intelligence forever. He warned them. One quiet evening, Burgess, volatile, impulsive, dangerously unpredictable, received the signal. McLean was out of time. The net was closing. And so the two men slipped away, leaving England behind like a door silently shutting on a long, complicated chapter of their lives. Burgess drove erratically across the country, cursing and chain-smoking as rain hammered against the car windows. McLean sat beside him, shaking, exhausted, terrified. And somewhere along the coast, the two men boarded a ship bound for France and then to Moscow. The news broke like a thunderclap. 2 British diplomats gone, vanished, defected. And Philby, the man who had helped coordinate anti-Soviet operations, now stood under a shadow even he could not charm his way out of. Suspicion grew. The Americans lost trust. MI5 circled him slowly, methodically. He denied everything, smiled softly, played the role to perfection. He was a master of silence, a sculptor of misdirection, and for a time he survived. But deep underneath, the unraveling had already begun, because betrayal does not stay quiet forever. It echoes, it leaks, it stains. And as tonight's story settles into the dim corners of this room, we begin to feel the weight of what these men set in motion. Not loud, not dramatic, but slow, like a crack spreading across glass. History was beginning to see their true faces, and soon the world would too.
Our story drifts into a quieter room, where betrayal no longer burns hot, but settles like dust, fine, cold, and impossible to sweep away. Because the final 2 members of the Cambridge Five were not storms like Burgess, nor charming enigmas like Philby. They were shadows that blended into carpets, corridors, archives, libraries, men whose greatest power was that nobody ever thought to look at them twice. And perhaps that is why their silence lasted the longest. Anthony Blunt moved through life with the elegance of a man born to privilege, soft voice, refined manners, a taste for art so deep that he became surveyor of the King's Pictures, one of the highest cultural positions in Britain. People saw him as a scholar, a guardian of paintings, someone whose world revolved around canvases and quiet study. No one imagined he carried decades of espionage in his breast pocket, like a folded letter. Yet during the war, Blunt served in MI5. His access was extraordinary. Files, interrogations, counterintelligence reports, lists of agents scattered across Europe, and quietly, steadily, without a tremor in his hand, he passed hundreds of secrets to the Soviets. Not for money, not for fame, but for an idea he had chosen long ago, when he was young enough to believe ideology was purer than people. And for decades, nobody suspected him. Even as Burgess and McLean vanished into Moscow, even as Philby fell under clouds of accusation, Blunt remained untouched, like a ghost standing perfectly still while the world searched everywhere except the one place he actually stood. John Cairncross was even more invisible. If Blunt was the elegant scholar, Cairncross was the quiet clerk, the man who walked softly through hallways carrying files tucked against his chest.
He had neither charm nor prestige, and in the brutal logic of intelligence agencies, that made him forgettable. Forgettable meant safe. Safe meant effective. Working in code-breaking and wartime intelligence, Cairncross passed material that shaped Soviet strategy. He leaked secrets from Bletchley Park. He delivered insights that saved Soviet divisions on the Eastern Front. And when the Cold War began, his information, like Blunt's, continued to flow steadily eastward. For him, there was no dramatic escape, no car races under the rain, no ship leaving in the night. His treachery was quiet, clerical, almost gentle, and maybe that is why it lasted longer than anyone imagined. But secrets do not sleep forever. They shift, they surface, they whisper in corners until someone listens. In 1964, MI5 confronted Blunt quietly, behind closed doors, no handcuffs, no trial. They offered him immunity in exchange for truth, and in a room with soft lighting and polished furniture, the elegant scholar finally admitted everything. For 15 years after that confession, the British public knew nothing. Blunt continued his work, his lectures, his public life, protected by a silence deeper than any lie. It wasn't until 1979, 45 years after he was first recruited, that the truth erupted into daylight. Newspapers screamed his name. The country reeled. Anger stretched across the island like a storm cloud. And still Blunt remained calm, as if the betrayal belonged to a different lifetime, a different version of himself. Cairncross, the quiet fifth man, would not be fully exposed until 1990. Almost the entire Cold War had passed by then. Generations had lived and died while his secret life lay hidden in footnotes and partial files. But the consequences of the Cambridge Five were not hidden. More than 300 Western agents were exposed because of them. At least 50 men and women, real people with families, with hopes, with memories, died because information they handled reached the wrong hands. The tragedy was not only political, it was painfully personal. Tonight, as we sit with these final echoes, the question that haunts this chapter is not how they betrayed Britain, but why. Why did some of the brightest minds of their generation, raised in comfort, educated in privilege, turn toward an ideology that would later reveal horrors they never foresaw? The answer is not simple. It is a tangle of idealism and arrogance, a generation shaken by the Great War, a belief that communism promised equality before its truth was known, a conviction that their own nation was corrupted, stagnant, blind. They did not betray for greed, they betrayed for belief. And belief, when it hardens into certainty, can be more dangerous than any weapon. As this chapter drifts to a close, we feel the lingering quiet they left behind. Not the sharp noise of treason in action, but the soft, steady hum of consequences unfolding over decades. The Cambridge Five did not just steal secrets. They stole trust. They stole safety. They stole the illusion that danger always comes from the outside. Sometimes it grows at home, wearing a scholar's coat, holding a file, walking softly through a hallway where no one thought to listen.
And so, as the Cambridge Five slip silently into the fog of history, 5 brilliant minds who chose ideology over loyalty, we close the first half of this journey.
From Mata Hari's last breath in Paris, to the nurses, fighters, and forgotten women who rewrote the rules of espionage, from coded telegrams that shifted empires, to betrayals whispered in dorm rooms and government halls, Part 1 has shown us one truth. History is not shaped by armies alone, but by quiet hands moving in the shadows. If your eyes are growing heavier, rest for a moment, because the story isn't ending, only pausing. In Part 2, we step into a darker, more complicated world. Assassinations carried out across continents, operations that seemed impossible, technologies that blurred the line between human and machine, and digital ghosts who changed the fate of nations without ever touching a battlefield. When you're ready, tomorrow night, or whenever sleep brings you back, Part 2 will be waiting for you. Quiet, patient, hidden in the dark, just like the spies we've been following.